Well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to begin our first workshop, which is Yeast, Salt, and Light, a recipe for a moving, meaningful, and mission-focused stewardship ministry. Again, I'm Marcia Shetler, Executive Director, CEO of the Ecumenical Stewardship Center. And before I came to ESC in 2011, I was Director of Communications and Public Relations for Bethany Theological Seminary, an administrative faculty position. I've spent my vocation working with churches at the congregational and judicatory level, as well as with Bethany and now with the Ecumenical Stewardship Center. So it's a delight to be with you today and to share this workshop. We will be taking breaks along the way for you to reflect on some questions. So you might want a pencil and paper handy or some way to type notes either on your phone or device. Also, you did receive PowerPoint slides of all of the presentations today. So that's another resource for you as we go through our workshops today. Here's some focus scriptures for us where we find yeast, salt, and light in the Bible. First, from Matthew 13, verse 3, "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, in which a woman took and hid 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened." In Matthew 5, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by men." "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." These are familiar scriptures for all of us, but I think especially at this time, this is a yeast, salt, and light moment for the church. In these scriptures, I believe Jesus was encouraging us to be infused in the world as yeast. And it's not always something that is flashy and prominent, but it infuses into our culture. And I think generosity is one place where this really does play out. We are charged to infuse ourselves as Christians into the world, especially around generosity. And we probably can all think of ways that that is happening at this time. Jesus also calls us to be salt. We are not to be bland. We are not to be blasé. We are to have a seasoning that attracts people. We are to be seasoning that helps people discern what is right and what is God calling us to do. And finally, we are to be light. It doesn't have to be splashy. It doesn't have to be something that's quite in the ways that we might think of the world, but we are to be light that draws people to Christ. We are not to hide our lights under bushels. But often, again, this is the way that generosity plays out. All of these, yeast, salt, and light, are very important to how we practice generosity. And in this moment, it's important to take a look at them and see what they mean for growing generous givers. I'd also like you to think about this in terms of technical change versus adaptive change. If you're familiar with Todd Bolsinger's book, Canoeing the Mountains, then you probably have a sense of what these terms mean, as well as you may have encountered them in other places. When we experience times of crisis, I think our first fallback and the first thing we try to do is approach them with technical change, because that can be the easier piece or the more immediate piece. It's an important piece to be sure, but it's also very important to approach with adaptive change, especially now, because the definition of adaptive change is to work at issues for which there are no answers. And right now, we really are in a period of unknown in this pandemic. I think there are many people who are trying to give us answers because they are living in this technical change mindset. That's where they're comfortable. But the truth of the matter is, we really don't know yet what the outcomes of this pandemic are going to be. So we need to adopt an adaptive change mindset in our ministry as a whole, and especially around our stewardship ministry. So let's take a look and see what yeast, salt, and light might have to do with them. Mission, meaning, and movement are the words that I like to assign to yeast, salt, and light. And we're going to look at those three. Let's start with yeast. Your church's mission is your grounding center. Create it by exploring what your church does best. In this time of the pandemic, you might be questioning that because there is so much that is unknown. When are we going to meet again in person for worship? What are we going to do when we're not passing the plate? How can people gather in small groups if they can't meet together? How can we address the needs of folks in our congregation who are struggling financially? How can we reach out to our vulnerable populations when we can't visit them anymore in hospitals or retirement communities? With each of these unsettling questions, I encourage you to go back to your mission. How does your mission inform how you answer these technical change questions? And if your church doesn't have a mission, I would really encourage you to find a way to create it. If you do have a mission, revisit it, because you want it to be relevant, not only in this time of pandemic, but moving forward as we continue to deal with those changes. It really does need to be relevant. What are some questions we can ask to create our church's mission statement, to understand what God has called us to do? And the answer will be different for every congregation. You have a specific and unique calling that no other congregation has. Think about that as you answer these questions. What energizes us? What do we do better than anyone else? And what resources do we need and need to have to do this? Keep your mission simple and memorable. I attended a church for about 10 years that it's been probably 15 years since I attended that church, but I still remember their mission statement because it was very simple. Love God, love people, celebrate life, and pass it around. This was a church that focused a lot on hospitality, and that was something that was infused into that mission statement. The mission statement was on banners in the sanctuary. It was in the bulletin every Sunday. Of course, we had worship in person. And it was something that folks who attended the church knew that it was important and put it into practice in very many ways. I know another church who begins with the whole congregation saying their mission statement every Sunday. And even in this time, while their pastor is recording and sharing their worship services, he invites those participating to share that mission statement every week. So a long, complex mission statement is not going to be helpful as you really boil this down. Think of something simple and memorable that really gets at these questions. What energizes us? What do we do better than anyone else? And what resources do we need and have to do this? Infuse your mission and your stewardship ministry into all of your congregational life. For example, the church that had a lot of focus on hospitality, their building reflected that. They had wide open spaces. They had people ready to welcome newcomers. They had materials ready to welcome newcomers and did it in a way where the newcomers did not feel intimidated. It was also a place of rich fellowship. Hospitality was not just for outreach, but it was for internal relationships as well. That's one example of infusing your mission and your stewardship ministry into your congregational life. So now we're going to pause for a moment, and I invite you to jot down some notes and some thoughts. The adaptive stewardship question that I would ask with starting with mission is, are you doing stewardship ministry or are you nurturing generous stewards? Are you looking at your stewardship ministry in a personal matter? Is it about helping people understand why this part of their spiritual journey and their discipleship and their walk with Jesus, that it's important to be faithfully generous? I think if you take that question to heart, it will change how you approach your stewardship ministry. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes to think about that question and make some notes. Let's move on to salt. Your church's unique calling is what gives your stewardship ministry its meaning. Create it by experimenting to find ways to make your stewardship ministry palatable, flavorful, and enjoyable. Adaptive stewardship opens the door for experiments. Don't be afraid to try new things. Certainly at this time, you've probably been trying lots of new things in your ministry. So it opens the door for people to be more flexible and to think about new possibilities. So you can take advantage of this moment to really do some experiments that can enhance your stewardship ministry. It's really important to understand your culture and context. As I said, every church is different. One of the blessings of this role at the Ecumenical Stewardship Center is that I have learned a lot over the past 9 years about the difference in denominations. I have a view of the church, I say, that most people don't get to see, because most people are familiar with their congregation, maybe their judicatory, maybe their denomination. I mean, there are levels there of engagement, and folks tend to think that all churches are just like theirs, and it's just not true. Your denomination will have particular pieces of your culture and context and practice that are sacred to you, and you want to make sure that your mission and your stewardship ministry and your experiments honor those particular beliefs and practices. Then there are the demographic issues. City congregations can be different from rural ones, different from suburban ones. Younger churches, different than older churches. How are you taking the demographics into account when you are thinking about experiments with your stewardship ministry? How are you addressing folks that, younger folks? How are you encouraging them to learn about stewardship? How are you honoring older folks and what they might be able to do for the church? And of course, congregational. What's your leadership style been? What do you need to think about there? What are your practices and traditions that need to be included in your culture and context? Certainly, we all know what it means to put too much salt on something, and it's not flavorful anymore. I mean, the scriptures talk about salt going bad, but there's also such a thing as too much salt. And at the same time, we have different tolerance levels for that. So understand your culture and context when you think about what practices can we put in place to develop a more effective stewardship ministry. So you mix that mission and that culture and context to get some meaningful best practices. Think about what is essential, what must not change, what is truly sacred. At the same time, what is expendable and can be discarded. And finally, what is adaptable? And right now you may be saying, you know what? Everything is expendable and can be discarded. Everything that we thought we knew about how church was supposed to be is turned on its head. Well, take a breath, take a moment, and say, there are pieces of our ministry and mission that we don't want to lose. There are things about our congregation that are really special that we want to honor. There are pieces of our denominational tradition that we don't want to lose. Mix those together. Get your meaningful best practices. Think about what you can experiment with to add meaning to your stewardship ministry. Stay away from stale. This is a great place to apply those adaptive challenge experiments to those technical challenges. And an example would be how you may be approaching giving beyond the offering plate. And I have heard many stories that underline for me that not one size fits all. I've been doing some workshops recently on this topic. One urban pastor reminded me, most people in our congregation are living very sparse economic lives. They don't even have bank accounts. To start online giving with them is not a possibility. So at that point, we talked about then best practices for people to give safely in a time of social distancing. Another pastor reminded me, our church has been around for 20 years and we've never passed the plate. From the very beginning, we've had an offering box in the back. And so for them, they had already made that leap, if you will, to practices beyond passing the plate. Another one said, you know, maybe our younger givers haven't been giving in church anyway because they don't have cash or checks. What can we do to make sure that they are included in our giving? So applying those adaptive challenge mindsets to technical challenges. It's also a great way to be a bridge to introduce the congregation and leadership to deeper issues. I think around younger people giving is one of those. It's really easy to make judgments and say, wow, these younger people just don't want to give to us. When in fact, the church has not been responsive to how they manage their finances. This is a great way to open up that conversation. So here's your adaptive stewardship question about salt. And again, I'm going to give you a few minutes to reflect and make some notes. Think about your current stewardship practices. And this may even be right now a 2-track train question, because you might want to think about your practices before social distancing and during social distancing. In any case, are your practices meaningful because they're comfortable or because they're making a difference? So give you a few minutes to think about that question and make some notes. All right, let's move on to light. Help your church find its fulfillment by making sure that your faithful, generous congregation is moving beyond the walls of its meeting place by evaluating. And many of you probably feel right now that you are moving beyond the walls of your meeting place, maybe in ways that are comfortable, maybe in ways that are not so comfortable. But it's important that you include evaluating in these changes that you want to make in your stewardship ministry. We heard from Janet the importance of putting plans in place. Make sure that you include a plan of evaluation as well. If you're going to make a change, make sure that you're going to have a way to mark and map how this change worked out or didn't work out. Observe what's happening. Our gifts went up by 25% because we included online giving, and we know that younger folks are contributing to that. Interpret that. What does that mean? That was a good idea because we were able to include some new givers, or implement or intervene. Maybe now the next step is to help younger folks understand their finances better. Or no, that really didn't work so well and we've had some complaints. We need to communicate why we are doing this, and so everyone understands its purpose, and always with your mission in mind. Keep your ministry relevant. Your church's witness is how you get noticed, both inside and outside the walls where your congregation meets. Going back to the church that had a focus on hospitality, was both to welcome the folks who were coming into the church, as well as how they treated each other within their community. Keep up with changes in culture and context. Boy, if that wasn't true 6 months ago, it is really true now. So many things are happening around what church might look like right now and farther down the road. And I really encourage you to take the time to look at good, deep evaluation practices. One of the things that I'm really ruminating about right now is churches who say they're getting so many more views on social media. Do you understand how those views are counted? In some social media, 3 seconds counts as a view. And you may have heard anecdotal stories like I have about what folks are doing on Sunday mornings, that they're church surfing and hopping in traditional ways, or I mean, not in traditional ways, in using the internet to church hop. So how are you evaluating that? As well as anecdotally, churches have moved their worship services online. My experiences is I see actually very few welcoming people visiting online. Remember that folks could be visiting from outside your church family right now. That's just one example of keeping up with changes in culture and context. So here is our question for light around adaptive stewardship. Are people from inside and outside the congregation involved in our evaluation? For example, ways that you might be reaching out to the community right now, maybe through a service project, maybe through some kind of technological outreach. Are you including them in that evaluation? How are you involving them in that conversation? How are you keeping connected with them? Again, I'll give you a couple of minutes to reflect on this question and make some notes. Let's talk a little bit about leadership roles. As you're growing faithfully generous givers, it's really important to have a healthy exchange between clergy and lay leadership. There are roles for clergy in this process. Clergy, it's important to encourage your congregation to look at stewardship as discipleship, as we've talked about. Congregations, I encourage you and lay leaders, give your clergy the freedom to teach and preach about stewardship as discipleship. Give them the assurance that it's not just about clergy salaries and that folks understand that. I am a minister's clergy spouse of over 40 years, and I can tell you that this fear is real. When your clergy look at the budget and see how much of the giving goes to their salary or to other staff salaries, and in some denominations know that this information is shared with every single member as they vote on the budget, this fear and discomfort is real. One of the most helpful things you can do for your clergy is to give them the freedom to teach and preach about stewardship as discipleship, that it's part of what it means to grow in our relationship with Jesus Christ. Something else that you can do that continues to be a matter of debate is thinking about giving clergy information about your givers because it is a matter of pastoral care. And this question was raised recently again in a webinar that I did, and it was an amazing question when one of the pastors said, I am an usher in church for the first time in my life. And then he went on to say that because they are not having worship now, folks are dropping checks off at the church, and oftentimes he is the only staff person there. He said they are dropping off the checks. They are not in an envelope. They are face up so that they are letting me see what they're giving. I have never had that experience before in my ministry, he said. And it was disconcerting. And so we talked about how much other information that clergy have about the folks in your congregation that really is a matter of pastoral care. I shared a story that recently for the Ecumenical Stewardship Center, I noticed that one of our recurring donors stopped giving. I found out it was because the spouse of that donor lost their job, most likely in response to COVID-19. Think about the spiritual matter that is related to what your folks are giving. Have an open and honest conversation between clergy and leadership about what would be the best practices for your church regarding giving as a matter of pastoral care. Lay leadership, what can you do? You can be the stewardship champions. Remember Janet's comment about leadership getting out of the way to help others lead? Your pastors, I would guess in 99% of the cases, would be delighted if you would volunteer to tell a stewardship story or arrange a stewardship story to be shared in worship or in your church communications. Help your congregation cultivate an attitude of gratitude. Help find people with appropriate gifts and skills to help in your stewardship ministry of growing faithfully generous givers. In that ministry, we need people who can manage, but in that ministry, We also need people who can inspire. It is not just about the numbers. It is not just about the budget. We need people who know how to encourage others to be faithfully generous. Be that stewardship champion, or encourage those you know in your church who are those stewardship champions to speak out. So let's review just a bit, and then we'll open up for questions. Let's go back to yeast. Your yeast is about your mission, which should be infused in all of what you're doing in your congregational life, including your stewardship ministry. If your stewardship ministry is bumping up against your mission, that's not going to be good for you moving forward. Make sure that it includes your core values. What are your core values as a denomination, as a congregation, with those demographics in place? What are the essentials of that? What are our sacred pieces that we don't want to lose? Those are all part of creating that mission. Then we add the salt to our practices. What makes our practices meaningful? What makes them flavorful, palatable? What makes your practices the kind that people will want to take a second helping of your stewardship, generosity, ministry potluck? What are the strategies and practices that we need to have in place? What do we need to do in the planning process? What are we going to do to really evaluate what we're doing now and see if it's meaningful or not? And then how will we experiment? How will we decide what we really want to keep and what it might be time to let go of now? And that changes from time to time. This isn't a one and done. I would encourage you to think about how you're going to do this review regularly. Even your mission statement should be reviewed regularly. And light. What is energizing about your stewardship ministry? What makes it noticeable? What makes it relevant? And how are you including both your internal and external communities as you think about how to make this light, really noticeable, really relevant to your community? So I'm open to comments now, and just remind you again that questions and comments should go in the Q&A, and the chat box is for technical questions. So as you do that, I see we do have one already, which is, I would love to hear ways people have engaged new online worshipers in evaluation. I'm not sure how to do that. So type their comments into the Q&A as well, and we can share them as we get those. So thanks for that question. Another one that has come up here is, what kind of evaluation tools have you found to be successful? Paper or online surveys or something else? When is the best time to administer? After service, during the week, through a small group setting? What would you consider a meaningful response rate? First, I would say yes, or all of the above. Again, I would go back to your particular context. How do folks in your congregation regularly communicate with each other? If you don't have a lot of folks who are online, that might not be the best way to start. Of course, right now, when we're not meeting physically, for the most part, that kind of negates being able to do that in a worship setting. You might want to send something out via postal mail if that's not going to be a big financial burden. So again, think about the best ways to make that work for you. When is the best time to administer after service during the week through a small group setting? Again, I would say, yes, you might want to do all of those. You might also want to think about just starting with your leadership. Do a survey with them and see what kind of responses you get. That might help you clarify it and then know what the best questions would be to ask to the wider community. What would you consider a meaningful response rate? That's one I think, again, that as a congregation you can work at. You might even want to set a response rate with your leadership to say, we will know when we feel comfortable moving ahead when we've had responses from X amount of our congregation. And then through multiple ways of doing that, you can continue to watch those numbers rise. If you have a good way to track folks, like having them submit their name and contact information, you can do a better job of tracking that. So you might want to set a benchmark and say, for us, if you have other ways that you make decisions as a congregation, put that metric in and say, for us, we will feel comfortable moving ahead when we've had responses from X amount of our congregation. Another question, how do you move a lower income congregation to a congregation of generosity? This is a great adaptive challenge question, because the first thing that I would invite you to do is talk a bit about what generosity means. Then I would also infuse in that, what does generosity mean in your context? I'm sure there are ways, and we've seen lots of examples of this in this time of pandemic, of people being creative about generosity that has nothing to do with dollars. We've also seen many examples of generosity where we thought there were no dollars and people gave in ways that were not expected. One resource that I would commend to you would be anything around asset-based management or asset-based discernment, where you come together as a group and list your assets. Even in your lower income congregation, you have assets, meaning there are unique things that you have in your congregation that God has blessed you with that no one else has. And when you list those, then you can start thinking about, wow, how can we be generous with this? Maybe you have a church building that could be used by a community group. Maybe that could even be a source of income. Maybe you can volunteer with a food gleaning network and bring those kind of resources into your community. Maybe you can find ways to support kids. Maybe there are folks in your congregation who would love to help kids that are troubled, just like Janet mentioned with the birthday cakes. So again, what does generosity mean is the first step. For your congregation is the second step. Think about how you can do this in a culture of asset management, what assets do you have? Framing that mindset of abundance around assets that we have, and then how can we implement that to be the kind of generous congregation that God is calling us to be. Another question, you have me thinking about how we can engage in online or socially distanced community in practical ways of doing mission outreach support as a community, especially if this continues for a long time. Yes, and I think that is the mode that we're all kind of in right now, is this is going to be different. How long is it going to be different? One way that I've been phrasing it is what's going to stick and what's not going to stick. I know some surveys have said, churches will go back to worship, but yet we'll keep that online presence going. Others have said we need to think about ways to engage our congregation when we go back, because actually right now we feel like we've been engaging more. Pastors are reaching out to individuals more, just checking on how they're doing. Others are engaging online in small groups, but we can't kid ourselves to say when things open back up, that will change what's happening now. Will folks go back and Sunday mornings, will they be elsewhere like they were ahead of time? We don't know. Here in the US, I saw a survey yesterday that said even when things open up, 80% of folks will be unsure that they will venture out. So we are in a time of unknown. I will say, one of the things that I haven't seen a lot of, because I think that churches have been focused so much on worship, I haven't seen a lot of ways to engage younger folks in church too much. I think maybe that's happening some in larger congregations. And of course, younger people have their own social networks that they're on all the time. And we have a 13-year-old granddaughter who lives with us, so I know of what I speak here. But I haven't seen a lot of reaching out to engage those groups in anything around the church. Maybe that's happening and I just don't know it, but I'm wondering if that is a place where the church can lean into and try to connect those dots around mission outreach support and engagement. We have a little more time if there's any other questions or comments. Again, maybe about engaging new online worshipers in evaluation. Here's another comment. I think a key adaptive change is how we do engage in online community or social distance community in practical ways of doing mission and community. Exactly right. Any thoughts? Okay, any suggestions on how to do this when congregations are merging with one another? Again, this is a great time to think about asset-based management. Instead of looking competitively to do and think about as much as you can collaboratively? What are we both bringing that will benefit the whole as we move forward together? Of course, in any denomination, that will be a different answer because of denominational polity. Some of those answers will be driven by what your denominational polity is and how you have to be attentive to that. But at a more leadership level and even at a membership level, to find ways to approach it from an asset-based management perspective. What gifts are we bringing that we can share with each other to benefit the whole? That's your ultimate goal. So how can we get there in more of a positive perspective than for one to say, well, this is ours and we're reluctant to give it up. And those are hard questions, but if you can approach it from a perspective of asset base and generosity, that might help. Great questions and comments. Thank you so much. There must be something maybe going on the side here. Is there an ELCA resource that's being mentioned that I missed somehow?
Responding to questions, Marcia.
Right. I see. Thank you so much, Keith. Is there a link to that resource? But I'm not seeing the resource.
Let me get the link and I'll post it.
Okay, that would be great. Any others? All right. I believe that Clayton Smith is with us now, who is our next workshop. We are running about 5 minutes ahead. And I'm wondering about perhaps just taking a 10-minute break this time and coming back at 20 minutes after the hour. Would there be any objection to that? Clayton says that sounds good. So let's plan to do that. We will break for now and come back at